Sawadee-ka. Hello and welcome to Daily Wisdom, Walking the Path with the Buddha. Today is our Pali Canon and English study group, and we're going to be studying the words of the Buddha. We're finishing up this book today, which is titled Walking the Path with the Buddha. This is volume 2 of the book series because we just restarted the Pali Canon and English study group a few weeks ago, and we're finishing up with chapters 41 through 51. So we have 11 chapters to study today. And as you guys know that have been attending regularly, the way that I do this is I invite volunteers from Zoom to be able to read a chapter from the book. Then I'll share some teachings on that, and then I'll open up to any and all questions that you guys have regarding the individual chapters. So I'm just going to jump right in so that we can actually start studying, since we have so many to study. That's actually 11 today. If there's someone who would like to volunteer to read this first chapter, if you could electronically raise your hand in Zoom and let me know, that would be wonderful. And then, okay, we've got Yihang and Vibhav and Samantha also volunteering. So I saw Yihang's hand first. I think she put it down. Are you there, Yihang?
Yeah, but I already unmuted myself.
Okay, yeah, go for it. Yeah, I saw your hand first, then I saw Vibhav, and then I saw Samantha. So we can have you guys read the first three.
Okay, thank you. Chapter 41, not understanding and not pretending the Four Noble Truths. Monks, it is because of not understanding and not penetrating the Four Noble Truths that you and I have roamed and wandered through this long course of the cycle of rebirth. What for? It is, monks, because of not understanding and not penetrating the noble truth of discontentedness, that you and I have roamed and wandered through this long course of the cycle of rebirth. It is because of not understanding and not penetrating the noble truth of the cause of discontentedness, that you and I have roamed and wandered through this long course of the cycle of rebirth. It is because of not understanding and not penetrating the noble truth of the elimination of discontentedness that you and I have roamed and wandered through this long course of the cycle of rebirth. It is because of not understanding and not penetrating the noble truth of the way leading to the elimination of discontentedness that you and I have roamed and wandered through this long course of the cycle of rebirth.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So here the Buddha is explaining how it's because one hasn't had this breakthrough to understanding the Four Noble Truths that one continues to experience the unenlightened mental state and therefore is continuing to be reborn in the cycle of rebirth. The Four Noble Truths is the very beginning of the path to enlightenment, and in those four simple statements, you understand the problem is discontentedness. The cause of that is craving, desire, attachment. The mind's craving permanence. Then the elimination of discontentedness is to eliminate craving, desire, attachment. And then it's the Eightfold Path that is going to teach you the way to completely eliminate craving, desire, attachment. And because one hasn't penetrated to understanding the Four Noble Truths, they haven't been able to understand what's causing their anger and sadness and frustration and all these other discontent feelings. So therefore, they haven't been able to get to enlightenment. And getting to enlightenment, one would have eliminated their craving, desire, attachment, which would mean that there would no longer be any discontent feelings, but there would also no longer be rebirth in the cycle of rebirth. So here the Buddha is casting this into a unique way of saying, hey, it's because of not understanding the very beginning of the path to enlightenment, understanding that craving is the cause to the problem, that this is why not only that you keep experiencing discontentedness, but this is also why you keep experiencing constant rebirth. So if you're interested in getting out of here, even though life can be quite enjoyable, and as you get closer to enlightenment, life will get really, really enjoyable for you. Everything's going to be enjoyable by the time you get to enlightenment. But in the unenlightened state, things can be quite miserable. And that can be motivation for us to get out of this whole cycle. It's almost like being trapped in an escape room, if you've ever done one of those escape rooms. And, there's all these clues of trying to figure out how to get out of here. And, some people really enjoy an escape room. I've never been to one, but people say they really enjoy it. Well, it might be fun to try to get out, but being stuck in a room for an exorbitant amount of time, that's no fun. And that's essentially what we've been doing, is we've been stuck in this cycle of rebirth for countless lives. And getting to enlightenment and training your mind, not only will you experience the peace and joy and all those other benefits of enlightenment, but you'll also escape the cycle of rebirth. And the Four Noble Truths is that very first step on the path to enlightenment. It's like the trail marker on the first part of the trail that explains to you kind of where you're headed on this journey. And then through penetrating that and through understanding it, that's what's going to help you to be able to really get moving forward on the path to enlightenment. So that's why the Buddha points to this over and over and over again. You'll see throughout his teachings, he's constantly pointing to the Four Noble Truths because that's the beginning. And oftentimes people are confused about where to begin. But where you begin is with the Four Noble Truths. That's where you need to begin. And to begin there, you need to begin with the three universal truths because that's going to help you to then understand the Four Noble Truths. Do you guys have any questions here on this one? Remember, for those of you guys that are on Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, you can put your questions into the comment section, or you can raise your hand electronically in Zoom and ask any and all questions that you like. Okay, I'm just going to check all of our platforms here. I think this one's pretty straightforward for most of you guys because you've been studying for a while. So, okay. So it looks like the next one here, I think that was Vibhav, was it? Or was it supposed to be Samantha? I think it was Vibhav, but I can't remember.
The mind has attained the end of craving. Through the round of many births I roamed, without reward, without rest, seeking the house builder. Painful is birth again and again. House builder, you are seeing, will not build a house again. All your rafters broken, the ridge pole dismantled. Immersed in dismantling, the mind has attained to the end of craving.
Okay, thank you, Vibhav. If you notice from the reference here, this one is referenced of DHP. And what that means is that it's from the Dhammapada. The Dhammapada is a section of the Pali Canon that some people consider it to be the words of the Buddha, but other people don't consider it to be the words of the Buddha. You essentially have three different baskets. You have the discourses from the Buddha, you have the conduct for the ordained practitioners, and you have the Dhammapada. This is the three areas of the Pali Canon. And what you're basically learning and what you need to learn in order to get to enlightenment is the discourses. And that's why this book series really focuses on the discourses. You won't even see very much of the monk guidance here because it's teaching them like how to wear the robe and how many robes they should have, and that they shouldn't be alone in a room with someone of the opposite gender and all these kinds of things that you don't really need as an unordained person. So that's why this book series mainly focuses on the discourses. But every once in a while, you'll see me put in a particular passage from the Dhammapada. And what the Dhammapada is and why some people don't consider it to be the words of the Buddha, me included, is that it's a scholarly work. That about 1,000 to 1,200 years after the death of the Buddha, scholars came together and they looked at his teachings and they tried to determine how to summarize his teachings in verse form, very poetic. And anything that you might know about the scholarly community is they're very interested in someone like the Buddha from a historical standpoint, looking at it from like an anthropologic viewpoint of how did this person impact the trajectory of humanity. They're kind of looking at those kinds of things. They're not necessarily interested in enlightenment itself. They're more interested in the research and the historical context of an individual like the Buddha, more so than his actual teachings. So these individuals came together about 1,000 or 1,200 years after his death, looked at his teachings, tried to kind of intellectually understand them, and then summarize them in kind of a poetic verse form. Well, in order to deeply understand the teachings of the Buddha, you need to be a practitioner of the teachings of the Buddha. And scholars are typically not practitioners of the teachings. Academics, scholars, professors that you see in a college, they might know some of the historical aspects of the teachings of the Buddha. They might know a little bit about what he taught, but they don't really deeply understand because they're not as interested in enlightenment itself and more interested in this historical context. So because the teachings from or the words from the Dhammapada are more of a summary in poetic form, there's some people who don't consider the Dhammapada to be the words of the Buddha, even though it's considered to be part of the Pali Canon. And I'm one of those people that I know that the Buddha didn't talk like this, because when you see his discourses, you can see that he didn't talk in poetry. And if you remember back to one of the chapters that we studied previously in this Pali Canon and English study group, is that he was talking about people who speak in poetry and how there's not really a way to penetrate into that and to investigate it. And someone who speaks that way is more speaking with conceited talk. And this is a conceited community rather than a community that's interested in investigation. But every once in a while, there is a particular section from the Dhammapada that it's kind of interesting to look at, because they are hitting the teachings right on the head. And it's a little bit in a poetic format. So these are kind of included here for you to be able to see that, because it can kind of bring home some of the teachings and help you understand them in a little bit of a different way. And here's what I mean by that. What this particular passage is talking about is saying, through the round of many rebirths I roamed, right? So through the cycle of rebirth, I've roamed and roamed and roamed, and there was no reward and there was no rest, right? This is essentially what we experience when we're stuck in the cycle of rebirth with craving, desire, attachment. It's just like go, 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 go all the time. And there's almost no rest, and there's no reward either, because those pleasant feelings you get are ultimately temporary. You can't keep it, and it fades away and leaves you in these painful feelings. And the reason why is because the mind is seeking the house builder, meaning the mind is craving for existence. It's craving to be in this world and picking up these 5 aggregates. It's seeking this house builder. Then the Buddha says, painful is birth again and again. Well, not the Buddha, but these, scholars that are interpreting the teachings of the Buddha are saying painful is birth again and again and again. And we know that to be true, because if you've ever delivered a baby, or you've been around beings that have delivered babies, or you know about people that are delivering babies, there's nothing that is unpainful about delivering birth, right? Like when a woman is delivering a baby, it's very, very, very painful for her. And also the baby too, the baby comes out crying. It doesn't come out laughing, right? It comes out crying because it's painful. So the Buddha's saying here, if this is an accurate interpretation, that yes, it's very painful to experience birth. Then here it's saying, house builder, you're seen, meaning I see you craving, desire, attachment. I see what you're doing. I see you keep picking up these 5 aggregates and you keep coming into this world over and over and over again. You will not build a house again, meaning you're not going to come back into this world again and continue to have existence over and over and over again. All your rafters broken, the ridge pole dismantled, meaning I've completely destroyed craving, desire, attachment, and now you can't come back into the world because I've been immersed in this dismantling. I've been immersed in this elimination of craving, desire, attachment, and getting rid of this out of the mind. The mind has attained to the end of craving. So when you attain the end of craving, not only is your mind peaceful and joyful, you're enlightened, but at that point, you're no longer going to experience rebirth, because there's no more causes and conditions that can lead to the next birth, because the fuel that causes rebirth is craving, desire, attachment. So this is a very interesting thing to kind of look at. Again, some people consider it the words of the Buddha, some people don't. You understand a little bit about the background of the Dhammapada and where it comes from. And whenever you see this reference, DHP, that's what it's referring to, is a section of the Dhammapada. Do you guys have questions on this one? Okay, looks like Yusuf might have a question here. Why is talking in poetry way is considered as conceited talk? When it comes to the teachings of the Buddha considers it to be conceited talk, not just in general, if you're generally having poetry, but when it comes to understanding the path to enlightenment, if somebody was just speaking in poetic form, that doesn't really give you anything tangible to be able to learn, examine, investigate, to reflect on, or whether it's true or false, and then to practice it. Right here, if you just read this, there's nothing to really independently verify, to reflect on, to independently verify, and then to practice. But if you look at the discourses of the Buddha, you can do that. You can examine them, you can reflect on them to verify them, and you can practice them. So the Buddha teaches about how during his lifetime, there was individuals who were just speaking in poetic form, and it's really easy for the ears. And this is one of the reasons why people are drawn to that kind of thing. But a community that's trained in investigation, not in conceited talk, you won't see necessarily a big plethora of people in that community, because it's only a rare individual that's willing to do the work to really investigate the teachings, to reflect on them, to independently verify them and practice them. This is why you don't see like 5 million people on a YouTube channel where somebody's sharing the original words of the Buddha, because it's not so many people that are really interested in deeply diving in and truly doing the work to roll up the sleeves and understand what it takes to get to enlightenment, because it's a lot of work for the mind to do that. But hey, you put out these teachings that kind of sound good, give you that warm fuzzy inside, a little bit of poetry that's easy on the ears. Yeah, you'll see, many, many millions of people out there that might be interested in that. But that's not actually what's going to lead to your enlightenment. It's doing the work to investigate the teachings. So that's what it means to be teaching with conceited talk, where it's just poetry. You're not investigating the teachings and verifying them and then practicing them. Okay, it looks like Vibhab, you have a question. Go ahead, sir.
So I have actually two questions. One is there is another reference, I think chapter 36, which is reference UD. Is it like Udana Nikaya or?
I don't think so. It's just the DHP that is the Dhammapada.
Okay. All right. So and then I also read that the Dhammapada is kind of used as the most important text in some places. A lot of people are focused on the Dhammapada and not on the other texts as a way to learn about Buddha's teachings.
That's the perspective of some people, but that's to their detriment. If you were to consider the Dhammapada, the words of the Buddha, and you focused exclusively on that, or even a significant portion of your time on that, I can easily say you'll never get to enlightenment. It's the discourses that are going to lead to cultivating the wisdom that you need to get to enlightenment. There's a lot of people who look to the Dhammapada and put it as something significant, but that's because it's easy on the ears, and they're not being trained in investigation. They're being trained in conceited talk, and they hear this poetic stuff, and it's like, oh wow, that sounds very poetic. And there's some people who think it's the words of the Buddha. They don't understand the history behind the Dhammapada, that it was written by scholars. They don't realize that it's not the original words of the Buddha. So the Dhammapada is like an interpretation of the teachings. So what you would have to do if you're reading the Dhammapada is you're reading an interpretation. You're reading somebody else's views on what the teachings are. And then you're having to interpret that poetry to be able to understand it yourself. So now it's like an interpretation of an interpretation. And what I suggest that students do is instead just go right to the source. Just go to the discourses. Because what the Dhammapada is doing is it's looking at the discourses and then interpreting them in poetic format. So rather than read an interpretation of the discourses, just go straight to the discourses, and that's where you're going to get the details of what it takes to get to enlightenment.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Looks like Helena has a question as well. Go ahead, ma'am.
Hi. Okay, so many people who believe in reincarnation, not rebirth, reincarnation, think that there is between reincarnations like a period of rest and maybe even planning the reincarnation ahead, choosing it, selecting. And how do we know that it's not true? How do we know that between rebirths there's barley and rest?
Yeah, so in between, the way that you'll understand that it's true is if you ever see your past lives, you will be able to see that. And you can see in this life, if you've had a life full of craving, you can see that you're just like go, 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 go all the time. So, the cycle of rebirth is what the Buddha taught, but oftentimes people talk about reincarnation and they talk about all these other things that aren't actually the teachings of the Buddha. And, oftentimes when they're talking about reincarnation, they're talking about a soul. And right away, that that's not the teachings of the Buddha, because he didn't teach that there is a soul or there isn't a soul. So this here, even though it is an interpretation, it's accurately reflecting what the Buddha teaches. And that's why I have it in here. Also as an opportunity to help students understand what the Dhammapada is.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Okay, let me check Facebook and YouTube. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions there. So let's move on to the next chapter. And I think Samantha was volunteering to read this. Very short one, Samantha.
In this fathom-long body, I say, friend, that by traveling one cannot know, see, or reach that end of the world where one is not born, does not grow old and die, does not pass away and get reborn. Yet I say that without having reached the end of the world, there is no making an end of discontentedness. It is in this fathom-long body endowed with perception and mind that I proclaim the world, the origin of the world, the elimination of the world, and the way leading to the elimination of the world.
Okay, thank you very much. So here, the Buddha is saying that, okay, that by traveling, one cannot know, see, or reach the end of the world where one is not born. What he's saying is, by being in the cycle of rebirth, you can't know the ending of the cycle of rebirth and how to escape it because you're still in the cycle of rebirth. So through traveling through the cycle of rebirth, you can't know, see, or reach the end of the cycle of rebirth where one is not born. You wouldn't know that. Where one does not grow old, one does not die, one does not pass away and get reborn. You wouldn't know that if you were actually in the cycle of rebirth. It's not until you get out of the cycle of rebirth and having done that work that you know that answer and you know what it means. He says, yet I say that without having reached the end of the world, there is no making an end of discontentedness. So without getting outside the cycle of rebirth, you can't end discontentedness because these two things are occurring at the exact same time. As you eliminate craving, desire, attachment, and you ultimately get to enlightenment, at that exact same time, you've escaped the cycle of rebirth. So that's what the Buddha is talking about here, that this is how you accomplish that by getting out of the cycle of rebirth, you are eliminating discontentedness. So he's just kind of wording that a little bit different. Now he's saying in this fathom long body, what fathom long means is fathom is a measurement that they used, a unit of measurement. And this was about 1.8 meters, which is about 6 feet. So we know that the Buddha was about 6 feet tall based on this description. So he's saying essentially in this 6 feet long body endowed with perception and mind, he proclaims the world, the origin of the world, the elimination of it, and the way leading to the elimination of it. He's essentially pointing to the Four Noble Truths again, and he's saying, okay, I've shared what it takes to be able to escape this cycle of rebirth and how to get out of this cycle of rebirth. That's what he's talking about here. He's not talking about the elimination of humanity or the elimination of the earth. He's using the word world here because he oftentimes refers to the realms as a world. He refers to these 5 realms as a world, and then he refers to like your next rebirth. He refers to it sometimes as the next world, right? And that's what he's kind of referring to it as. Like each existence, you're existing in the world. And to escape this world of the cycle of rebirth, you need to be able to get out of the cycle of rebirth, end the mind's discontentedness through eliminating craving, desire, attachment. Are there any questions here on this one? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So let's go to the next one then. The next one is chapter 44. Is there someone who would like to read this one? This one is about the Buddha getting old. Okay, Vibhav, go ahead, sir.
The perfectly enlightened one's complexion is no longer pure and bright. The limbs are all flaccid and wrinkled. Then the Venerable Ananda approached the perfectly enlightened one. Having approached and paid homage, respect, while massaging the perfectly enlightened one's limbs, he said to him, "It is wonderful, Venerable Sir. It is amazing, Venerable Sir. The perfectly enlightened one's complexion is no longer pure and bright. His limbs are all flaccid, soft and hanging loosely, and wrinkled. His body is stooped, and some alteration is seen in his sense spaces. In the eye sense space, the ear sense space, the nose sense space, the tongue sense space, the body sense space. So it is Ananda. In youth, one is subject to aging. The health one is subject to illness. While alive, one is subject to death. The complexion is no longer pure and bright. The limbs are all flaccid and wrinkled. The body is stooped, and some alteration is seen in the sense spaces. In the eye sense space, the ear sense space, the nose sense space, the tongue sense space, the body sense space. This is what the perfectly enlightened one said. Having said this, the fortunate one, the teacher, further said this. Fie on you, wretched aging, aging which makes beauty fade. So much has the charming puppet been crushed beneath advancing age. One who might live 100 years also has death as destination. Death spares none along the way, but comes crushing everything.
Okay, thank you, Vibhav. So here, this is one of the Buddha's students, Ananda, going to the Buddha and kind of making an observation about his physical body as he's getting close to death. Because here, this is when he's old, but you're going to see here in a moment that we're going to study his final words when he's actually getting closer and closer to death. Here, his student is noticing that there's been this deterioration of his sense bases, that his eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body are no longer functioning in the same way that they once were. Remember, there's 6 sense bases, so they're leaving out the mind sense base. And the Buddha does the same thing when he's confirming, yes, there is a deterioration of the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. But notice he's not talking about any deterioration of the mind. When you see the words of the Buddha, when he's actually getting close to death, you can see his mind is just as sharp, just as focused, just as concentrated, just as wise at any other time during his life once he got to enlightenment from the age of 35 to 80. Oftentimes we associate old age with deterioration of mental faculties. And that's because oftentimes the examples that we have around us is that maybe our parents or our grandparents, as they age, maybe their mind deteriorated. And that is true for an unenlightened being. Someone who hasn't actually trained their mind, you'll see a deterioration of the mind. But for someone who's actually trained their mind, you won't see that deterioration. As you're training the mind and you're getting to this enlightened mental state, it's a permanent mental state. Your mind will never regress backwards. So while you might not be able to see as well, hear as well, smell as well, you won't have the same taste and the body won't have the same sensations, the capacity of your mind and the sharpness and crispness of your mind, having trained it on the path to enlightenment, that won't fade all throughout your life, even as you get older. So you don't have to be old and grumpy or old and having a deteriorating mind, because that's typically what people associate with old age. You can actually be old and cheerful, old and joyful, and you can also be old and concentrated and focused and have deep wisdom as well. It all depends on the choices and decisions that you make in your life. The things that the Buddha talked about in terms of this regard here and in other places, he talks about training the mind, and he even talks about how the mind won't regress backwards once you get to a certain point in your training. This is all being confirmed in modern research. We see that doctors and scientists and researchers are studying the brain because we're training the mind, which is intangible and non-physical. But when we're doing that, it has an effect to the brain, and the physical structures of the brain are changing. And we can see this through MRIs and CAT scans and other devices, which the Buddha couldn't see during his lifetime, but he knew the results because he was experiencing it himself, and his students were experiencing this too. So now we're confirming through medical technology that when one is training the mind, there's changes to the brain. And once you get to a certain point with those changes, the brain never goes back to the way it was. So things like Alzheimer's or dementia or things like this that we tend to associate with old age, you can actually eliminate that, the potential of that to ever be experienced within your own mind, within your own brain, by training your mind and uprooting these pollutions, getting your brain to change in this positive direction, that once you get to that point, the brain will never go back to the way it once was. And this is one of the other benefits of having gotten to enlightenment. And even if you fall short of enlightenment, there's still physical changes that are occurring as you're making your way through the jhanas and into the 4 stages of enlightenment. Even that first, second, and third stage of enlightenment, there's physical structures of the brain are changing as you're going through that. We'll actually get to a point during this generation where we'll have enough enlightened beings and we have the medical technology that we're going to be able to look at brains and be able to tell what an enlightened brain looks like. And that's going to happen in this generation where we didn't have that ability in the past. So this is something that's very interesting to look at, and it's very encouraging for you to know that any training that you put forth, that your mind's not going to deteriorate if you continue with your training. Now, if you get complacent and say you're short of the first stage of enlightenment, your mind can deteriorate, your brain can deteriorate and go backwards and regress. But once you get to that first stage of enlightenment, your mind won't decline from there. It won't regress. And you can continue to progress from that point forward. And this is one of the very encouraging things about doing this work. It's a permanent solution that, yeah, it's a struggle, it's a challenge. While it's not easy to get to enlightenment, it's not difficult either, but all that work that you're putting in, it is a permanent solution that once your mind gets to that point, it won't regress backwards. And then here, down towards the bottom, you can see the Buddha talking about how death spares no one, right? Including a Buddha. As you're going to see here in a minute, he talks about his own death, right? That's the one thing that we all are going to experience. Everything in life is optional, but we all are going to experience death. We don't have a choice in that matter. We will experience death. But if we get to enlightenment, then at that point, we're not experiencing death. We're experiencing what's called final enlightenment. And I'm going to explain to you guys what that is in the next chapter, I think it is, where the Buddha talks about his final enlightenment. So you can escape death by attaining enlightenment. And then on your last existence, when there's death, then the physical body's dying. But you'll see what I talk about when we talk about final enlightenment and what's actually occurring there. So if you guys have questions on this chapter, let me know. I'll be pleased to help you. Remember, you can put that into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and ask any questions that you like. So Yusuf has a question. Would an enlightened being ever have Alzheimer's disease? No, it's physically impossible for an enlightened being to experience that. They will never experience that whatsoever. And that can be one of the motivations to get to enlightenment. If you've been around people that experience dementia, it can be very impactful to their life. It can be impactful to your life if you're caring for that person. And knowing that you can escape that, not only can you escape dementia, but you can also escape things like bipolar, depression, schizophrenia, bulimia, anorexia, panic disorders. All these different things can all be eliminated from the mind. Okay, Vibhav, you have a question? Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering whether when there's I guess, what scientists talk about is genetic disposition to some diseases. There's some genes in your body which predispose you to certain diseases. Like in my family, my grandfather had Parkinson's, my uncle has Parkinson's. And my dad does not have Parkinson's, but he has other diseases.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the genetic disposition that you have to certain diseases would, I guess you were saying is that even something like mental disorders like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's will not occur for an enlightened being, even though you might be genetically disposed to them, or you are basically gone beyond the effect of genes in that case.
Yeah, this is one of the misunderstandings in the world. Is there are certain things that an individual experiences and it's being attributed to genetics. And this isn't actually true. If you talk to doctors and researchers and scientists about what they understand and what we understand as a humanity in a collection of teachings about the human body, they will tell you the thing that we know the least about is the brain. And if you talk really closely with them, what you might find out is that they think that out of everything there is to know about the brain, that they only know about 1% of the actual wisdom that there is to know about the brain. So there's a lot of kind of educated guess in the medical community, and they're kind of working on that assumption or that hypothesis, right? Well, if you study these things really closely and you look at how the mind functions in a family, for example, and you understand enlightenment, you can understand why what I'm sharing with you is that these things aren't necessarily genetic. That what's happening is that a child growing up in a family who lacks wisdom of these teachings, and maybe they're bitter and harsh and hostile, and maybe they're arguing with each other, maybe there's all kinds of difficulties and struggles in this family. This individual is maybe growing up, seeing mom and dad fighting and arguing, maybe they use drugs or alcohol or things like this, and those parents don't have the wisdom of how to problem solve and how to solve their problems. When they have problems, they turn to maybe alcohol or drugs. And now the child growing up, having seen that all their life, when they then get to be an adult, they don't have the wisdom of how to problem solve. So they might choose to turn to alcohol and drugs. And now what the medical community says is, oh, this is genetic. Because what they're seeing is oh, mom and dad drank, so therefore child drinks, so this is a genetic thing. When in reality, all it is that the child didn't learn the wisdom growing up of how to problem solve. What that child learned is when you have problems, you turn to alcohol and drugs, or you turn to arguing and fighting and things like this. And that's why the child's brain is not functioning in the way that it could be if it actually learned these teachings and trained the mind and gained the wisdom that it takes to problem solve. And now, having trained the mind, the brain will function differently. So there's a lot of misunderstandings around mental illness, that these things aren't a defective brain. And there's a lot of misunderstandings around other things too, like dementia and Parkinson's disease and all these other kinds of things. In fact, there's a student that studies with me here in Thailand who was diagnosed with Parkinson's before studying with me, and since learning with me over the last year, I think it's been, they've commented to me that they've significantly reduced their medications. I think they've eliminated completely 3 of their medications, some of their significant medications, and they're looking to get rid of some others as well because they're seeing significant improvements to the condition of their mind and their brain. And this is their doctor that's helping them to get off of these medications. So right now, what is kind of common knowledge is that these things are either genetic or a brain defect, or we're predisposed to these kinds of things. But in reality, what you'll be able to see as you train more and more and you see what it takes to get to enlightenment, that it's just a lack of wisdom, that the mind hasn't been trained since early life, that it's accumulated these pollutions through conditioning of the mind and through experiencing growing up in a household that doesn't have this wisdom. And now the person's mind, and thus their brain, is not functioning in the way that it could be. And now if they actually start training their mind, they can purify their mind, and now the physical structures of the brain change. Regardless of who their parents are, they will be able to accomplish that.
Thank you. So I guess what you were saying is, if I were to maybe try to state it a little bit differently, or I'm just trying to rephrase you a little bit, is because of dependent origination, the consciousness, like the person has been born into a family which may have all these predisposed conditions, but by training the mind and following the path, he'll be able to, and trying to get out of that, the conditions that have he's been born into, and he can basically get out of that and then not be, and be enlightened, not be reborn. I guess that's what you're trying to say.
Yes and no. What I'm sharing is that the condition of the brain is a function of the condition of the mind. That it's not that the brain is defective, it's that the mind is untrained and that it's so polluted that it's affecting the brain. And now if you clean up the mind, now the brain will start to function the way it's intended to function.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't see any other questions, but let me just check Facebook and YouTube. Okay, I don't see any questions there either. So let's move to the next one, which this is the last words of the Buddha. Go ahead, Yusuf.
The Tathagata's final passing. Monks, for this reason, those matters which I have discovered and proclaimed should be thoroughly learned by you, practiced, developed, and cultivated, so that this holy life may endure for a long time, that it may be for the benefit and peacefulness of the multitude, many people, out of compassion for the world, for the benefit and peacefulness of heavenly beings and humans. And what are those matters? They are the 4 foundation of mindfulness, the 4 right efforts, the 4 bases of mental power, the 5 spiritual facilities, the 5 mental powers, the 7 factors of enlightenment, the Noble Eightfold Path. And now, monks, I declare to you, all conditioned things are of a nature to decay, strive on unceremoniously. The Tathagata's final passing will not be long delayed. 3 months from now, the Tathagata will take his final nibbana, final enlightenment. Ripe I am in years, my life span determined. Now I go from you, having made myself my refuge. Monks, be untired, mindful, disciplined, guarding your mind with well-collected thoughts. He who tirelessly keeps to the guidance and teachings, leaving birth behind will put an end to sorrow and despair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. So this first section that we have here, this is actually the Buddha informing his students about 3 months before he's going to die, that he's going to die. This is how enlightened he is, that he knew exactly when he was going to die, and he could see that point in the future. And he wisely gave his students a heads up, because if there's anybody who was attached to him, they could slowly let that go over the next 3 months. So this first section here that we have, this is him giving his students a heads up, where the last part is actually his final words. And what he's saying here is he's saying, okay, I've proclaimed what it takes for you to get to enlightenment. And I taught you what it takes to be able to escape the cycle of rebirth and get to this peaceful and joyful mental state. So if you're interested in keeping these teachings very, clear in the world and be accessible to many others, this is what you should actually practice. So this is him giving his guidance about what you should practice as the core central teachings of the Buddha. He says the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 right efforts, the 4 bases of mental power, the 5 spiritual faculties, the 5 mental powers, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and the Noble Eightfold Path. These are the core central teachings according to the Buddha. And these are all things that you're going to be learning throughout all the various programs and courses and retreats that I share. Oftentimes what the Buddha does in his discourses is he leaves the most important thing for last. You'll see this throughout his discourses, that as he talks, if he gives out a list of things, he will oftentimes leave the most important thing for last. It's the Eightfold Path that is the core central teaching, that is the consolidating all the other teachings. So that's where an individual really needs to start. There's some people who spend 6 months, a year even, just thoroughly learning and practicing the Eightfold Path. You need to know that inside and out. And the 4 foundations of mindfulness and the 4 right efforts are actually part of the Eightfold Path, but the Buddha is highlighting those as something to be able to understand. And then he finally says, okay, I declare to you, all conditioned things are in nature to decay. What he's saying here is that even him as a Buddha is impermanent. He's saying everything that's conditioned are of a nature to decay, meaning they arise, they change, and they fade away. And even the Buddha, having been born, he changed and then he faded away. He died, right? Just like every other being. And now that he's dying, he's saying, strive on untiringly. Because in order to get to enlightenment, it takes a certain amount of dedication and diligence. And you're going to need to bring that through your journey, right? There's certain struggles that you'll experience along the path. And as you're striving, you're going to need to do this untiringly, because sometimes it does get tired. You might get tired as you're unenlightened. By the time you get to enlightenment, you won't be tired any longer. So as you're striving on this path, there's no harm in stepping back and kind of giving yourself a breather and, kind of allowing the mind to rest a little bit. But you're going to need to remain consistent and determined and dedicated and diligent to your meditation practice and to your learning and to your development on the path. Oftentimes, the Buddha is referring to himself as the Tathagata. This is how he would oftentimes refer to himself, because he rarely referred to himself as a Buddha. That what the word Tathagata means is the one who's discovered the truth, or one who shares the truth. So he's talking about himself here in the third person, which is a way to train the mind to let go of personal existence view. So having let go of personal existence view and no longer having that, he didn't refer to himself frequently as the Buddha or I or anything like that. He's just using the word Tathagata, which means the one who shares the truth or one who's discovered the truth. And then he's saying that within 3 months from that time that he's talking, that he's going to experience final enlightenment or final nibbana. We refer to an individual who's gotten to enlightenment and dies as final enlightenment, that they now are experiencing final enlightenment. They're not experiencing death, because death is experienced for one who's in the cycle of rebirth. If you're in the cycle of rebirth, you've now died, and now there's going to be rebirth because there's now been this death, right? But by the time you get to enlightenment and you die at that point, or the physical body has been exhausted, you've now reached what we refer to as final enlightenment. And the reason why we refer to it this way is that during your life, you can eliminate all your cravings, desires, attachments, and you can get to the point where the mind no longer experiences any discontentedness. There's no mental anguish or stress or anxiety in the mind whatsoever for an enlightened being. But you still experience physical pain in the enlightened mental state. the physical pain that you experience is very muted compared to what you experience in the unenlightened state. And the reason why is because in the unenlightened state, you will experience physical pain. And then because the mind is craving permanent comfort of the body, the mind will then experience mental anguish, that it'll be frustrated or agitated or annoyed. So if you've ever like stumped your toe in the middle of the night, you felt the physical pain. And as soon as the mind experienced that physical pain, there was immediately this craving for permanent comfort that kicked in. And now this discontentedness arose in the mind, this anger or frustration. You might have been blaming other people or so angry. And when this is occurring, as that mental anguish is arising, the mind is actually experiencing an increased amount of physical pain because that mental anguish heightens the physical pain. So in the unenlightened state, that's what you're experiencing, the physical pain and the mental anguish going right along with it because the mind is craving for this permanent comfort. But by the time you get to enlightenment, you won't have the mental anguish. You'll still experience some physical pain, but it's very muted and almost insignificant compared to what you experienced before. You might even start laughing. You might even start being joyful when you're experiencing that physical pain in the enlightened mental state. You might not be able to imagine that today, but as your mind moves closer and closer to enlightenment, you'll be able to experience this and see for yourself. So there's that one thing that you can't eliminate as long as you're alive, which is the mind being connected to the body. But when an enlightened being gets to the end of this life where the body's been exhausted, now the mind and the body separate, and now there will no longer be any physical pain. So that's why we refer to it as final enlightenment. That last attachment has been eliminated, and now there's no longer any physical pain. An enlightened being needs physical pain. You wouldn't be able to survive without that. Because if, as an enlightened being, if you're standing too close to a fire, for example, the body sends a signal to the mind that, hey, you're standing too close to the fire, you're getting hot here, you might need to make a decision to move away from the fire. And this is helpful even for an enlightened being to be aware of that, because even though an enlightened being is very wise and they're paying attention to what they're doing, there might be an occasion where they're standing somewhere and maybe some flame comes out, or there might be some heat or something like that. Or maybe as they're in a large crowd, maybe, they're kind of jostled or moved into a position where there's a lot of heat coming from somewhere. So you need that little bit of physical pain just to kind of alert the mind that, hey, there's something going on here. You should take corrective action. So if you're like sitting in meditation, for example, and you feel a little bit of pain in the hip, you need to know that so you can take changes, because that's the mind's way of being alerted that, hey, you need to take some action here. So it's at the time of death for an individual who's gotten to enlightenment, or what we would typically call death, that this separation of the body and mind is occurring, and now the individual has attained final enlightenment. Here, the Buddha is also talking about striving on untiringly. He's talking about some other things as well, like how he was his own refuge, meaning his own protection. He was protecting his own mind through training his mind. As I mentioned, getting to enlightenment, you're going to need determination and dedication. So you're going to need to continue to pursue. And there's going to be times where you need to step back and relax a little bit, digest maybe a retreat that you've taken in or a certain learning program. You're going to need to digest that. But nonetheless, you keep with your meditation practice and you keep moving forward. You're going to need to practice mindfulness in order to get to enlightenment, where you're aware of the mind, you're consciously aware of the mind, and that you have discipline of the mind. This is where you have control of the mind. The Buddha is talking here about guarding the mind with well-collected thought. And remember, these are his parting words. These are his last words. So he's helping individuals to understand that, hey, this is what you need to do to get to enlightenment, is guard your mind with well-collected thought, meaning that you don't just haphazardly make decisions in the world, that you think through the decisions that you make, because every decision you make, it's going to produce a result, either wholesome or unwholesome. So you would like to come with your well-collected thoughts and make a wise decision. If you're ever noticing that you're in a hurry to make a whole bunch of rapid decisions, that's based in craving, and you would like to restrain the mind and pull it back. Because if you just put out a bunch of decisions based in craving, all that stuff's going to come back to you. So slow the mind down, restrain it, guard your mind with mindfulness or this awareness of mind. And now you can have well-collected thought where your mind can be disciplined and you can then make wise decisions that's going to produce wholesome results in your life. And then he says, He who tirelessly keeps to the guidance of the teachings, leaving birth behind, will put an end to sorrow and despair. Right? So if you stay close to the teachings and you gradually learn them and develop your mind based on the teachings, you'll make an end to this cycle of rebirth and you'll put an end to discontentedness. That's what the Buddha is sharing here. So this part down here is his final words that he's sharing. Oftentimes people think that the Buddha actually died through eating like a poisonous sandwich or something like this. You'll hear all kinds of different things. In this particular chapter, you guys know that each chapter I share words that will help you to be able to reflect and implement the teachings into your life. Well, here is quite a lot in this chapter. If you've read it already or if you haven't read it, I have in here a lot of details of what final enlightenment is. I have in here what happens at the time of death for you. I have in here what happens to the mind upon death. I have in here if someone attains enlightenment, what happens to the mind? Does it disappear? Is the mind or soul spirit the same thing? And then ultimately I have in here, how did the Buddha die? This is an article that was published by a Thai doctor who was a doctor prior to ordaining. And now with that medical knowledge and having studied the teachings of the Buddha as an ordained practitioner, he looked at all the evidence of what was being described around the time of the death of the Buddha. And with his medical knowledge, he was able to narrow down on exactly what caused the death of the Buddha. And he does a very thorough job of explaining this about what we know, about the timing of his illness, about the diagnosis of it. He talks about this particular illness that he thinks that he actually had. He talks about the progression of the disease. He talks about analysis and retrospect. He goes all the way through all of this and then ultimately comes to a conclusion. And then I give some thoughts here as well to be able to help you as well. So this is a very important chapter because oftentimes people are really interested in what was going on during the death of the Buddha around that time, but also people are frequently interested in understanding what's going to happen to them at death. So this chapter will help you to be able to understand that. So you can take your time working your way through this because it's quite extensive compared to some of the other chapters. Even though the words of the Buddha here are quite short, I've used this as an opportunity to really help you to understand this topic of death, not only for the Buddha and an enlightened being, but also other beings as well. And you can walk your way through this. So let me know what questions you guys have here by putting that into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and ask any questions that you like. So Helena, looks like you have a question. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. So he's talking about 5 mental powers. What's that?
Right here. I have I have these in another chapter. I haven't memorized these. I haven't committed them to memory, but I have them as you go through the book series. You'll be able to see. I think it has to do with like confidence and wisdom. I can't remember 100%, but it's going to come up because I put it into the book series so that you'll understand what it is. I just haven't committed it to my memory.
Okay, thank you. And then he's talking about, as we talked in the morning, about the heavenly beings that benefit from the teachings. Mm-hmm. And why don't heavenly beings have their own Buddha who would understand better how it is to live in heaven?
So there's only going to ever be one Buddha at any one given time during the life. And whatever a Buddha is describing, that's the same thing that heavenly beings need. And it's the same thing that human beings need because it's the natural laws of existence. So there isn't ever going to be 2 Buddhas that exist at the same time. And there's only needing to be one for the human realm. And then the heavenly realm can learn from that same Buddha as well.
Wow. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the last question is, can an enlightened being have headache? Or can an enlightened being have cancer?
So an enlightened being can have a headache from things like, say, air pollution. Like, say they were like in a certain area and now they've got a headache from air pollution. But, you know, they're not going to have a stress headache, for example. They're not going to have migraine headaches because those usually come from from stress. So they're not going to have those kinds of headaches. But let's just say they went a little while without drinking water. They might get a little bit of a headache or something like that. But of course, they're going to be wisely drinking water, and they're going to ensure they don't get to that point. But they can occasionally experience a headache here and there, but it's very minimal and few and far between. They don't really experience it. It's usually environmental variables that isn't something that they're controlling. Of course, they can make decisions to leave that area, but they're going to potentially be in that particular area, and maybe slowly but surely there's been some pollution and now they've got a headache. So it is possible to experience a headache, but it's not coming from the things that an unenlightened being would experience a headache from.
Okay, and cancer?
Oh, cancer. Yes, I would suspect that an enlightened being can experience cancer. Because cancer is on the cellular level, it's with the physical body, it's not with the mind itself.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Yusuf, you have a question?
Is it possible that in any realm of the five realms that the beings there can live without a body, just a mind?
So the formless realms, you might consider them to be living with just the mind, like hell, the afflicted spirits in the heavenly realm. They're formless beings. They don't have physical form.
Okay, so it is possible to live with only a mind. So if an enlightened being died, there is a possibility that he live with just his mind, without like the need to be reborn in any of the five realms with a body or without a body. There is a possibility, I mean.
This is an undeclared teaching that the Buddha didn't declare whether that's true or false. He just left it as an undeclared teaching. And it's best for you to think of it that way as well, because if there was this idea that there was potentially some existence after enlightenment, the mind could potentially be craving that in the unenlightened state, and therefore you'll never get to enlightenment. So it's best to just always understand that what happens to an enlightened being after death, in terms of whether there is or isn't an existence, that it's better to just leave that as an undeclared teaching. We know with 100% certainty that an enlightened being isn't in the cycle of rebirth anymore, but whether there is some kind of existence after that, that's an undeclared teaching, and it's best to always think of it that way, because that'll ensure that you don't have any craving for any future existence. Because by the time you get to enlightenment, you need to be peaceful and joyful and content in the present moment. But if the mind is still longing, yearning for this afterlife, then it's very challenging for the mind to let go of that craving.
Sure, thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Okay, Vibhav, you have a question?
Yes. I'm not sure if you explained this before, but I wanted to understand. You said that there can be a long time span before rebirth, like you can have few. I mean, rebirth is not instantaneous, where there have to be the right conditions for a person to be reborn into the consciousness. And so I was wondering if there's an explanation for what happens to when a person dies and the mind and body is separated, what happens to the state of the mind before it's reborn into another consciousness, another body? Like, is it there's some stream of consciousness I don't know what it's called, but some stream that is moving in the universe, that is all the collected people who are not reborn yet, or collected minds that are not reborn yet, and just moving through this stream. Does the question make sense? Or
yeah, I understand what you're saying. You're saying from the time of death for an unenlightened being until the time they're reborn, what's happening in between there, right?
correct, yes.
Okay, so the Buddha doesn't really share very detailed teachings on this, because it doesn't actually lead to your enlightenment. It doesn't lead to the elimination of craving, desire, attachment, and the elimination of discontentedness. I do remember one discourse where he was kind of alluding to a couple of things, but it's not really clear, and it's not one of those teachings that you actually need in order to be able to get to enlightenment. But there is something that's happening in between there, and we just don't have 100% insight into what that is. there can be an extensive amount of time between births. I've seen up to about 2,000 years in between. So there's something that's happening, but what that is, we don't have 100% insight into that.
Okay, so and one other question I wanted to ask the last time, but I did not ask. You said that the heavenly beings can have any cravings that we have, and we were talking about chocolate cake. So I was wondering if heavenly beings can have a craving for chocolate cake.
I don't suspect so, because they're not eating, food, because they have a formless existence. But all the things that fit into, that kind of realm, they could have all the same cravings as us, right? That don't involve physical form.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. All right, Julie. Julie, you have a question?
Yes. Were you showing something on the screen earlier that's not in the book? You were talking about a doctor's article or something.
It's actually in the book. For this chapter 45 and all the other chapters too, I have text below the words of the Buddha. And if you read through that, by the time you get down here towards the end, there's an article that I've inserted in here that is from a doctor, which is how the Buddha died.
Yeah, that's what I couldn't find. So what page is that then?
Do you have a printed version, or do you have an electronic one? Okay, if you have a printed version, this is something that I've added, I would say, in the last 4 months. So it might not be in the printed version that you're looking at. But all the new ones,
I couldn't find it anywhere. And I thought I saw like a page 151 or something, and mine doesn't show that.
Yeah. Did you purchase that a few months ago?
Last week.
Oh, last week.
No, last week.
Oh, okay. I better.
No, wait a minute. No. Right at the start of this course, when we started this book.
Okay, so I need to update this and make sure. Okay, I need to update the Amazon and make sure that this is up there, because I've added this several months ago. So
I just ordered this like right before we started going on this book.
Okay, thank you for letting me know that, Julie. I will update the book, and then if you would like to see this, you can download it because it's online and you'll be able to see it there.
Okay, great. I just thought I was kind of losing.
No, just some impermanence, Julie. That's it. Okay. So Chris is asking a question. If I start to get stressed, I notice that listening to your podcast helps my mind remain at ease, return to ease, or at least become more at ease. Is this wise, and is it part of guarding my mind with well-collected thought? Yeah, you can use those kinds of things, but you just got to be sure that your mind doesn't get attached to it, Chris, that if you're dependent on listening to a podcast in order to get to a more comfortable state, this is the mind having craving, and now it's experiencing a conditioned feeling. So while you might use that for certain periods of time, you're going to ultimately need to get to the point where you can eliminate whatever craving, desire, attachment is causing your stress, so that then you can eliminate the stress. The listening to the podcast isn't what's eliminating the stress. What's helping you is that your mind is being redirected away from whatever you're craving, and that's why the stress is being reduced. So you need to look inward and see what the cravings are so that you can then eliminate those, and that's what's going to eliminate your stress. Samantha's asking a question. She says, the explanation of this chapter says, cremation hastens the breakdown of the body. Logical. Does this have any effect on rebirth or not, since body is separate from mind? Yeah, it doesn't have any effect because they're two separate things. And by the time the cremation happens, the mind's long gone. So choosing to cremate the body doesn't have any effect to rebirth whatsoever. And also, those decisions are typically being made by people afterwards, unless the person's made the decision before they died. And, okay, Vibhav is saying the Kindle version of the Amazon book has it. So sounds like I need to just look at that and be sure that I get it updated. Okay, so thank you guys for that insight. Let me just check Facebook and YouTube. Looks like Janae has a question on Facebook. So because the Buddha was the first person to reach enlightenment, he had to seek refuge in himself because there was no other Buddha or community of practitioners. Yeah, that's true. But it's also true to a certain extent, even for the average enlightened being, that you're still looking to yourself for your own refuge. You're going to need teachers and guides to help you. So the Buddha talks about, coming to him, his teachings in the community as a refuge, but he also talks about using yourself as your own refuge. So you're going to need the teachings, right? You're going to need that as a refuge. But you're also going to need to look at yourself as being on your own independent journey. That's the way I describe it. The Buddha talks about making yourself an island in your own refuge. And I describe that as you are on your own independent journey. And as long as you keep that in mind, that way you're not reliant on other people and you don't become dependent on them for every last little thing that you're looking for. Instead, you realize that you need to stand up on your own 2 feet. So what you're saying here is 100% true. And you can also see that's true for just an average enlightened being as well, except the fact that they need guides. They're not going to be able to get to enlightenment by themselves. We have some questions coming in here from Gabi on YouTube. Let me see. I'm trying to get my screen set up. Hi, Teacher David. I was wondering, how is the moment of a person's death determined according to Buddha? While in some religions, it is believed that God decides when a person should die. What does Buddha say about how and when death occurs? So the Buddha doesn't really talk about that specifically from what I've seen, but we understand what causes death, that it's the natural law of karma. It's cause and effect, or action and result. So for example, let's just say you're a very angry, very hateful, very vindictive person all through your life. Your mind has all this stress and frustration and anger. That's putting a lot of stress and pressure on the physical organs. And let's just say you did other things too. Maybe because of that, maybe you smoked or used alcohol, maybe you ate bad food. You're going to tend to die a lot quicker than somebody whose mind is relaxed and peaceful and joyful. And maybe you're eating healthy foods and getting a little bit of exercise. So it's the cause and effect. It's your decisions. Any kind of decisions that you make wisely are going to produce wholesome results. When you're making unwise decisions, it's going to produce unwholesome results. And this is why some people die very early in life and some people die older in life. It's all based on our decisions. So it's not God or anything like that that's determining when you die. It's your decisions that is determining that. And it's the cause and effect, and you're experiencing the results of that. All right, I had a feeling there was going to be lots of questions on death. This is a topic that oftentimes people have a lot of questions about. Vibhav, you have some more questions?
Yes, I had a question around, I read somewhere, I'm not sure which sutta it is in, or is it in a sutta at all, but there was this question where, or there's some text saying that there was a chance for Ananda to ask the Buddha to stay around for eons, and he passed that chance, and when he actually asked again, he said the time for that has passed. I was wondering if that's true or it's a misreading of the suttas.
No, that's in the suttas. You'll see that in the discourses and in this book series. You'll see it when we get to it.
Okay, we'll talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, so let's move to the next one, which is after we get through all this text that you guys have the opportunity to read and learn about if you like. And now let's get to the next chapter, which is chapter 46. So someone who would like to read this? Okay, Samantha. Thank you, ma'am.
One who sees the teaching sees me. Enough, Vakali. Why do you want to see this foul body? One who sees the teaching sees me. One who sees me sees the teachings. For in seeing the teachings of Vakali, one sees me, and in seeing me, one sees the teachings. Monks, even if a monk taking hold of my outer robe were to follow right behind me, placing his feet in my footsteps, yet if he were to be craving for sensual pleasures, strong in his passions, evil in mind, corrupt in his decision-making, his mindfulness muddled, unalert, uncentered, his mind scattered, and his sense bases uncontrolled, then he would be far from me and I from him. Why is that? Because he does not see the teachings. Not seeing the teachings, he does not see me. But if a monk were to live 100 leagues away, yet if he were to have no craving for sensual objects, were not strong in his passions, not evil in mind, uncorrupt in his decision-making, his mindfulness established, alert, centered, his mind at singleness, and his sense bases well restrained, then he would be near to me and I to him. Why is that? Because he sees the teachings. Seeing the teachings, he sees me.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So this is also a discourse that the Buddha was teaching as he was nearing closer to death. Even though we read his final words, we're still seeing some discourses here that as the Buddha was getting close to death, because one of his students, like Vibhav was just describing, was kind of pleading and begging for the Buddha not to die. And the Buddha essentially says, one who sees the teachings sees me. One who sees me sees the teachings. What he's saying is that if you've learned the teachings well enough and you've studied them close enough, then when you look around the world, you're going to see the Buddha everywhere around you. Because if you've learned the universal truth of impermanence and you look around the world, you're going to see impermanence everywhere. If you've learned that craving, desire, attachment is what causes discontentedness, when you look around the world, you're going to see countless beings experiencing discontentedness based in their own cravings, desires, attachments. If you understand the universal truth of non-self, you're going to see people constantly getting angry or upset or frustrated or even pleasant feelings based on the personal existence view. And we could just go on and on and on and on and on about how the mind functions in terms of the mindfulness and concentration and the 5 precepts, and how making those decisions wisely or unwisely will produce wholesome or unwholesome results. The more you understand the teachings of the Buddha and you look around the world, you're going to see his teachings everywhere, because he's describing the natural laws of existence to you. And if you know those teachings, you will see him everywhere. But also, one who sees me sees the teachings. What he's meaning here is that he's a living, breathing, walking example of his teachings. That during his life, whatever he was teaching, that's what he was practicing too. So he didn't teach right speech and then practice wrong speech, or he didn't, teach right livelihood and then practice wrong livelihood. He was a living, breathing, walking example of his teachings, because a Buddha understands that their students are learning just as much through their spoken words as they are through their actions. That as they're navigating the world, their students are learning through their spoken words and their discourses, but their students are also learning from observing them. And a Buddha will be a living, breathing, walking example of their teachings. So this is what the Buddha is describing here. And then he kind of gives you this analogy where he's talking about, somebody being far away from him, being close to him, but if they physically close, but if their mind didn't understand and had all this longing and yearning and craving, then they would be far away from the Buddha. But even if somebody was physically far away from him, but they were practicing the teachings closely, then they would be very close to him, because when they see the teachings, they see him. Any questions on this chapter? Chapter 46? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So I'm going to move on to the next one, which is 47. So someone who would like to read this one? Okay, it looks like Keely would like to read. Go ahead, ma'am.
One who resides in the teachings. Here, a monk learns the teachings, the discourses, mixed prose and verbs, explanations, verses, inspired spoken phrases, quotations, birth stories, amazing accounts, and questions and answers. But he does not pass the day solely in learning the teachings. He does not neglect seclusions, but devotes himself to internal serenity of mind. It is in this way that a monk is one who resides in the teachings. Thus, monk, I have taught the one absorbed in learning, the one absorbed in communication, the one absorbed in recitation, the one absorbed in thought, and the one who resides in the teachings. Whatever should be done, monks, by a compassionate teacher, out of compassion for his disciples, aspiring for their welfare that I have done for you. These are the fit of trees. Monks, these are empty huts. Meditate, monks, do not be complacent, lest you regret it later. This is my instruction to you. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
So during the lifetime of the Buddha, in order to be able to get to enlightenment, you would need to have learned the teachings and committed them to your memory 100%. That's the only way that they had to be able to practice the teachings, because they didn't have written words. The technology to write things down existed in China, but it didn't exist in that region of the world. So they would use chanting as a way to commit the teachings to memory. They would recite the words of the Buddha word for word for word for word every 2 weeks, and that's how they were able to remember them. And what he's saying is that, people have been absorbed in learning, in communicating, meaning discussing the teachings, reciting the teachings word for word for word. That's the chanting, absorbed in thought, and one who resides in the teachings, right? So being in the teachings, that's what's actually going to help you to actually get to enlightenment, is fully engrossing yourself and understanding what the teachings are. And then along with that, you're going to also need to meditate as well. That with meditation, you're going to be able to fully transform the mind, because you've learned the wisdom from the discourses, and now you're training the mind with meditation and all the other techniques. And then the Buddha also reminds his students here that whatever a compassionate teacher would do for their students, he's done that for them, that he aspires for their welfare. And that's why he's actually done what he's done. Imagine being a prince, destined to become a king, and now you step down from that, right? Anybody who's interested in a certain type of life, you might just think that being a prince or a king would be maybe the very best thing that you could do for some people. Some people might really aspire to have that, or be a queen or a princess or something like that. But if you can imagine how special enlightenment must truly be, if he was willing to step away from the monarchy, and not only that, but once he got to enlightenment, he didn't go back to be the king. He didn't go back to assume the throne, or even be just an average member of the royal family and live in a life of luxury. He decided to stay out there in the homeless life, just living off the donations of whatever people gave to him, because he was interested in sharing the teachings with others, because he had compassion for the welfare of all living beings. Compassion is the concern for the misfortune of others. And he's reminding students of why did he teach? Out of compassion for them. And this is why it's so important that a teacher who's sharing the path to enlightenment, that they don't charge a fee and they don't have a price for their courses. Because getting to enlightenment is a multi-year pursuit, and you're going to need to take these programs and courses multiple times. You're going to need to read these books multiple times in order to get to enlightenment. And if a teacher was charging a fee, say for their foundational class, like you guys know that I teach that course, and I said to you, you need to repeat this 2 or 3 times in order to get to enlightenment. If I was charging a fee for that, you might think that my interest was to make money from you. But by not charging you anything for anything that I do, you can see that, wow, this teacher is just really interested in helping me. And that's what the Buddha had as well, that he wasn't expecting anything or wanting anything from his students. He was just doing it because he had concern for the misfortune of others. So it can be very clear in the mind of the student of why is this person sharing these teachings. And an individual who's sharing without any price on their courses or classes or retreats, they're doing so out of compassion for their students, and they understand the path to enlightenment, that those students are going to need to practice generosity in order to be able to get to enlightenment. And that's why a person might set up in that way to provide the opportunity for their students to practice generosity, and also to make their teachings available to the widest audience possible, that there's going to be some beings who aren't able to maybe provide any financial support. But if you had a price on their courses, it would immediately hinder them from being able to get access to the courses. So by not having a price, then an individual can service all individuals, no matter what part of society that they're in, because having a price on a course would immediately outprice and hinder someone who's struggling in life, whom we might say actually needs the teachings the most, someone who's challenged and maybe impoverished, maybe in generational poverty. They actually need the teachings even more so than maybe somebody else. So this is why the Buddha taught, is because he had compassion for the welfare of all living beings, including his students. So any questions here on this particular chapter? Looks like Chris has a question here. What was Gautama Buddha referring to when he said, these are the feet of trees, these are empty huts? This is the places where people would meditate during the lifetime of a Buddha, is that they would go into the forest and they would sit at the foot of a tree, or they would go to an empty hut, right? Where nowadays we might say, here's a meditation cushion, here's a park, don't be complacent, lest you regret it later. Go meditate, right? That's what he's essentially saying in a very friendly, warm, and loving way. Okay, let me see if we have any other questions. Don't see any questions anywhere else. So let's move on to the next chapter, which is 48. Is there someone who would like to read this one? Maybe I'll take this one. Oh, Vipab, you like this one? Okay, go ahead.
One who has attained Nibbana in this very life. Monk, if one teaches the teachings for the purpose of fading away of strong feelings towards aging and death, but is fading away in elimination, one is fit to be called a monk who is a speaker of the teachings. If one is practicing for the purpose of fading away of strong feeling towards aging and death, but is fading away in elimination, one is fit to be called a monk who is practicing in accordance with the teachings. If through fading away of strong feelings towards aging and death, through its fading away and elimination, one is liberated by non-clinging, one is fit to be called a monk who has attained Nibbana, enlightenment in this very life. In the case of birth, existence, clinging, craving, feeling, contact, the six sense spaces, name and form, consciousness, volitional formations, choices, decisions, and ignorance, unknowing of true reality, the discourses are identical except for the reference to each of the conditions of dependent origination.
Okay. So thank you, Vibhav. What you guys are going to learn as we progress in the program, you're going to eventually learn dependent origination, which is in volume 5, chapter 14. And I mentioned to you about that in a previous class, that if you'd like to get a preview of that, you could easily go study that now, because it's going to take you multiple times learning that before you fully understand it. This retreat that's coming up this week, I'm going to be teaching dependent origination in that towards the end of the retreat, so you can be learning it there as well. And it's going to be recorded, and it has been recorded in the past where I've taught dependent origination. This is what you're actually dismantling. The Four Noble Truths gives you just a window into the unenlightened mind, as well as craving, anger, and ignorance, the 3 poisons. That also helps you to understand the unenlightened mind, as well as the 10 fetters. That's helping you to understand what the unenlightened mind is experiencing as problems. Dependent origination is showing you the interlinking steps that leads to aging and birth and death and grief and sorrow and despair. And that's what you're ultimately dismantling. So the Buddha here is teaching you about how elimination of clinging is what's actually going to eliminate and dismantle the dependent origination. Essentially, what's going to lead to your enlightenment and what's going to lead to the ending of the cycle of rebirth. And then there's each individual case of the dependent origination that the Buddha refers to here. So we're going to explore this in a lot of detail once you get to volume 5, chapter 14. So here, do you guys have any questions on this particular chapter, the way it's written and the way it's being shared? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions here. So let's move on to 49. Anyone would like to read this one? Okay, Julia. Or Julie. It looks like Helen is after that.
The 3 urgent tasks. Monks, there are these 3 urgent tasks of a farmer. What 3? First, the farmer swiftly yet thoroughly plows the field and swiftly yet thoroughly harrows it. Next, he swiftly sows seeds, and then he swiftly irrigates and drains the field. These are the 3 urgent tasks of a farmer. This farmer has no psychic potency or spiritual might by which he could command, let my crops start growing today. Let them mature tomorrow. Let them bear grain the day after tomorrow. But with change of seasons, there comes a time when the crops grow, mature, and bear grain. So too, monks, there are these 3 urgent tasks of a monk. What 3? The undertaking of the training in the higher virtuous behavior, moral conduct, the undertaking of the training in the higher mind, mental discipline, and the undertaking of the training in the higher wisdom. These are the 3 urgent tasks of a monk. This monk has no psychic potency or spiritual might by which he could command, Let my mind be liberated from the taints by non-clinging today or tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Rather, as this monk trains in a higher virtuous behavior, moral conduct, the higher mind, mental discipline, and the higher wisdom, there comes an occasion when his mind is liberated from the taints by non-clinging.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So the Buddha is very commonly using these farming analogies to help people understand his teachings, because people would understand farming analogies back then, where now we might use computer analogies or mobile phone analogies or driving cars and airplanes, because people are familiar with these kinds of things, where here people were familiar with farming. And the Buddha is giving these three urgent tasks of a farmer. If you know anything about farming, plowing the field is just turning over the land. Harrowing it is to line up the dirt and kind of create like these nice rows. And then sowing seeds is to actually plant the seeds into the ground. And this farmer doesn't have the ability to say, let my crop grow right away, right, and produce some kind of benefit. He doesn't have that ability. But slowly but surely, this crop grows, matures, and it bears grain. And the Buddha is saying the same thing, that there's these three urgent tasks of anybody who's on the path to enlightenment. And these all sync up with the Eightfold Path. Here he's saying moral conduct, mental discipline, and the higher wisdom, where when you look at the Eightfold Path, we call it wisdom, moral conduct, and mental discipline. But what he's pointing to here is the Eightfold Path in a summarized version. He's saying this is what you should focus on. This is your immediate priority when you're on the path to enlightenment, is to learn the Eightfold Path. Not only does he point to the Four Noble Truths over and over again, but he points to the Eightfold Path because that's a core central teaching. And then, having learned the Eightfold Path, you're not going to be able to say, let me get to enlightenment today, tomorrow, or the next day, right? It's not going to be possible to do that. Sometimes the mind craves to get to enlightenment when you start hearing about this peace and joy of the enlightened mind. But if you get rid of that craving, desire, attachment, and you gradually chip away at this, that gradually your mind will move to the enlightened mental state more and more and more. That's what the Buddha is talking about here with an analogy, is that there's this gradual training, gradual practice, and gradual progress. And you'll see him talk about this occasionally, where sometimes people want it to be a 1 week thing or a 1 month thing or a 3 month thing, or at the very most, maybe 6 months or a year. But when you really understand the path to enlightenment, you understand that your mind didn't get in this condition in just a few weeks or a few months, and it's not going to be eliminated in just that short amount of time either. That even the Buddha, it took him 6 years to get to enlightenment. So it's going to take you some time. Not necessarily 6 years. It could be shorter than that. It could be longer than that. Because remember, the Buddha was doing it by himself. So it took him a pretty significant amount of time, but it could be longer, it could be shorter. And you're not interested in measuring and comparing yourself to anyone. You're not interested in hurrying up and racing to enlightenment. Anyone that's trying to hurry up and get to enlightenment, they haven't understood the very first thing about enlightenment, which is eliminating of craving, desire, attachment. If you're longing, yearning for enlightenment, you won't actually be able to get there. So you need to pursue it as a goal, objective, or interest gradually, as the Buddha is essentially describing here. So are there any questions here that you guys would like to ask? You can put that into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or raise your hand in Zoom and ask questions. All right, I'm not seeing any questions here. Helena, if you would still like to read, you're welcome to read this one. I saw your lips moving.
The Tathagata resides compassionate towards all living beings. Venerable Sir, doesn't perfectly enlightened one resides compassionate towards all living beings? Yes, Headman. The Tathagata resides compassionate towards all living beings. Then why is it, Venerable Sir, that the perfectly enlightened one teaches the teachings thoroughly to some, yet not so thoroughly to others? Well then, Headman, I will question about this. Answer as you see fit. What do you think, Headman? Suppose a farmer here had 3 fields, one excellent, one of middling quality, and one inferior, rough, salty, with bad ground. What do you think, Headman? If that farmer aspires to sow seed, where would he sow it first? Excellent field? In the middling quality.
Sounds like your internet's cutting out on us, Helena.
The one that was rough, salty. If okay.
Yeah, it's cutting in and out on us. You maybe try some more. Let's see. Maybe it'll straighten up for you. We lost you up here. Maybe Chris is offering.
Yeah, maybe it's better if someone else reads.
Okay, looks like Chris is offering to read. Would you like to read, Chris?
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I can read. Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Okay.
Thank you, Helena.
Where would he sow it first? In the excellent field, in the field of middling quality, or in the field that was inferior, the one that was rough, salty, with bad ground? If, venerable sir, that farmer aspires to sow seed, he would sow it in the excellent field. Having sowed seed there, he would next sow seed in the field of middling quality. Having sowed seed there, he might or might not sow seed in the field that was inferior, the one that was rough, salty, with bad ground. For what reason? Because at least it can be used as fodder for the cattle. Headman, just like the field that is excellent are the male and female ordained practitioners to me. I teach them the teachings that are good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, with the right meaning and phrasing. I reveal the holy life that is perfectly complete and pure. For what reason? Because they reside with me as their island, with me as their shelter, with me as their protector, with me as their refuge. Then headmen, just like the field of middling quality, are the male and female household practitioners to me. To them too, I teach the teachings that are good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, with the right meaning and phrasing. I reveal the holy life that is perfectly complete and pure. For what reason? Because they reside with me as their island, as their shelter, with me as their protector, with me as their refuge. Then headmen, just like that field that is inferior, rough, salty with bad ground, are the ascetics, Brahmins, and wanderers of other communities to me. Yet to them too I teach the teachings that are good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. With the right meaning and phrasing, I reveal a holy life that is perfectly complete and pure. For what reason? Because if they understand even a single sentence, that will lead to their welfare and peacefulness for a long time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Helena, as well. So here, the Buddha is once again masterfully talking to this individual who's asked him a question. He's saying, do you reside compassionate for the welfare of all living beings? And the Buddha says, yes, I do. He says, then why is it that you teach some people thoroughly, but yet you don't teach others quite so thoroughly? And then here's where the masterfulness comes in with the Buddha, where he says, okay, let me ask you a question, right? Because this person already knows the answer, but he just hasn't related it to the way that the Buddha teaches, because this individual makes the same decisions like the Buddha, but just related to something else. So the Buddha is going to ask him these questions in order to help that person arise wisdom to see that he's doing things very similar to the way that the Buddha does. So this person, is familiar with farming. So he asked him, hey, if you had these three fields, one excellent, one middle, and one inferior quality, which would you plant first? And he says, oh, I would plant seeds in the excellent quality field first, and then the middle quality, and then the inferior quality. That's how I would actually plant this. And the Buddha says, yeah, just like you, I do the same exact thing. Right? That the male and female ordained practitioners to me, I teach them the teachings that are good in the beginning, middle, and end with the right meaning and phrasing. I reveal the perfectly complete holy life to them, right? Because they are essentially coming to him as their primary teacher. So he's teaching them very closely. And then he's looking at the household practitioners as being middle quality. But even though he knows that they're not necessarily practicing the teachings as closely as the ordained practitioners during the lifetime of the Buddha, he says, I still teach them the teachings that are good in the beginning, middle, and end. He's saying basically, I don't treat them any differently, but yeah, they do have a different quality in terms of how they're practicing. Nowadays, you don't necessarily see this in all situations, where during the lifetime of the Buddha, ordained practitioners were definitely practicing a lot closer in most situations because they had more time to learn and practice. Where nowadays, you can actually run across household practitioners that are actually practicing a lot closer than the ordained practitioners. So during the lifetime of the Buddha considered the household practitioners to be this middle quality because they didn't have the amount of time to be able to dedicate to learning and practicing that an ordained practitioner would have. But he still taught them the same. He still treated them the same. And then that's because they saw him as their primary teacher. So that's why he taught them in that way. But then there were these other individuals, other ascetics and Brahmin and wanderers of other communities who were learning from other teachings. And he says those too, he still teaches them the teachings that are good in the beginning, middle, and end, right? He's still teaching all these people the same, but not because that they're considering him to be their primary teacher, but because if they just even understand a single sentence of what he's teaching, it would lead to their welfare and peacefulness for a long time, because they're out there learning with other teachers that they're going to get really confused about what it is that they're learning because they're not learning with the Buddha as a dedicated teacher. But even if they just understand one sentence, this will actually really help them. So even if they understand loving kindness eliminates anger, and that's the only sentence they ever understand, and now they work on developing more and more loving kindness, this can be very good for their welfare and peacefulness for a long time. Even if they understand practicing singleness of mind, doing just one thing at a time will lead to concentration. This would lead to their peacefulness and welfare for a long time. So that's what the Buddha is teaching you here. Any questions on this particular discourse? This is chapter 50. The Tathagata resides compassionate towards all living beings. He treats all beings equally. He doesn't treat one being another way and another being another way, but he does see the true reality that ordained practitioners during his lifetime were practicing closer. And that's just because they had more time, essentially, to be able to learn, where the household practitioners were focused on just sustaining their life and doing household duties to be able to sustain their life. So any questions here? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. So we have one more chapter for today, which will round out our book. Is there someone who would like to read this? Okay, Julie, go ahead, ma'am.
4 observable benefits for one who learned the teachings by ear. Monks, when one has learned the teachings by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with mind, and penetrated them well by view, 4 benefits are to be observed. What for? Here, a monk masters the teachings, discourses, mixed prose and verse, expositions, verses, inspired spoken phrases, quotations, birth stories, amazing accounts, and questions and answers. He has learned those teachings by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with mind, and penetrated them well by view. He passes away, muddled in mind, and is reborn into a certain group of heavenly beings. There, the happy ones recite passages of the teachings to him. The arising of his memory is sluggish, but then that being quickly reaches distinction. This is the first benefit to be observed when one has learned the teachings by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with the mind, and penetrated them well by view. Again, a monk masters the teachings, discourses, mixed prose and verse, expositions, verse, and inspired spoken phrases, quotations, verse stories, amazing accounts, and questions and answers. He has practiced those teachings by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with mind, and penetrated them well by view. He passes away, muddled in mind, and is reborn into a certain group of heavenly beings. There, the happy ones do not recite passages of the teachings to him, but a monk with psychic potency, who has attained mastery of mind, teaches the teachings to an assembly of heavenly beings. It occurs to him, This is the teachings and discipline in which I formerly lived the spiritual life. The arising of his memory is sluggish, but then that being quickly reaches distinction. Suppose a man were skilled in the sound of a kettle drum. While traveling along a highway, he might hear the sound of a kettle drum and would not be at all confused or uncertain about the sound. Rather, he would conclude, that is the sound of a kettle drum. So too, a monk masters the teachings. The arising of his memory is sluggish, but then that being quickly reaches distinction. This is the second benefit to be observed when one has followed the teachings by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with mind, and penetrated them well by view. Again, a monk masters the teachings, discourses, mixed prose and verse, expositions, verses, inspired spoken phrases, quotations, birth stories, amazing accounts, and questions and answers. He has learned those teachings by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with the mind, and penetrated them well by view. He passes away muddled in mind and is reborn into a certain group of heavenly beings. There, the happy ones do not recite passages of the teachings to him, nor does a monk with psychic potency who has attained mastery of mind teach the teachings to an assembly of heavenly beings. However, a young heavenly being teaches the teachings to an assembly of heavenly beings. It occurs to him, these are the teachings and discipline in which I formerly lived the spiritual life. The arising of his memory is sluggish, but then that being quickly reaches distinction. Suppose a man were skilled in the sound of conch. While traveling along a highway, he might hear the sound of conch, and he would not be at all confused or uncertain about the sound. Rather, he would conclude, that is the sound of a conch. So too, a monk masters the teachings. The arising of his memory is sluggish, but then that being quickly reaches distinction. This is the third benefit to be observed when one has learned the teachings by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with the mind, and penetrated them well by view. Again, a monk masters the teachings, discourses, mixed prose and verse, expositions, verses, inspired spoken phrases, quotations, birth stories, amazing accounts, and questions and answers. He has practiced those teachings by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with the mind, and penetrated them well by view. He passes away muddled in mind, and is reborn into a certain group of heavenly beings. There, the happy ones do not recite passages of the teachings to him, nor does a monk with psychic potency who has attained mastery of mind teach the teachings to an assembly of heavenly beings, nor does a young heavenly being teach the teachings to an assembly of heavenly beings. However, one being who has been spontaneously reborn reminds another who has been spontaneously reborn. Do you remember, dear sir? Do you remember where we formerly lived the spiritual life? The other says, I remember, dear sir. I remember. The arising of his memory was sluggish, but then that being quickly reaches distinction. Suppose there were two friends who had played together in the mud. By chance, they would meet one another later in life. Then one friend would say to the other, do you remember this, friend? Do you remember that, friend? And the other would say, I remember, friend. I remember. So too, a monk masters the teachings. The arising of his memory is sluggish, but then that being quickly reaches distinction. This is the fourth benefit to be observed when one has learned the teachings by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with the mind, and penetrated them well by view. These are the four benefits to be observed when one has learned the teachings by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with the mind, and penetrated them well by view.
Okay, thank you, Julie. So here, you can summarize this entire discourse to be able to understand that what the Buddha is teaching you is that if you learn the teachings in one life, and you don't get to enlightenment and you're reborn into either the heavenly realm or the human realm, you're still going to have memories of those teachings. And now, having those memories in that next life, you can arise that memory. It's going to be sluggish potentially, but eventually you can arise those and recall the teachings from a previous life. And now you can get to enlightenment in this life. So if you've been learning these teachings and they just make sense to you and they're really straightforward, this could be because you learned them in a previous life. And now your memory might be sluggish, but eventually you'll be able to get to the point where, you remember the teachings more and more closely. And if you find it really, really challenging to learn these teachings and it feels like you're walking through mud sometimes, this could be because you haven't learned the teachings in a previous life. But no matter what, whatever you do in this life, if for some reason you fall short of enlightenment, you're going to be able to benefit from what you're learning here in a future life. And that's what the Buddha is teaching you here about these 4 different benefits. Of course, the ultimate goal is to get to enlightenment, but if for any reason you fall short of that, the work that you're doing now is going to benefit you in that future life as well. Not only is it benefiting you now because your life and your mind's becoming more peaceful and more joyful, but it can also benefit you in the future as well. And now the Buddha here is saying these are the 4 benefits to be observed. It's important that you understand that when he teaches these kinds of things, he's not saying these are the only 4 benefits. Oftentimes people insert that word within their own mind. They think that this is the only 4 benefits. This isn't actually the way the Buddha taught. He will sometimes say, like, these are the 4 benefits of practicing this. And then you'll see another discourse where he says, these are the 6 benefits. These are the 5 benefits. And you put all these together and you might have like 15 benefits or 20 benefits. So it's important that you don't insert words that aren't there. These aren't the only 4 benefits of practicing the teachings and learning them, but these are 4 of the benefits of having learned and practiced, that you can retain the understanding and the wisdom that you have learned and acquired in one life, and now use that to your benefit in a future life as well. So let me know what questions you guys have here on this chapter. You can put that into Facebook, YouTube, or in Zoom. Looks like Vibhav has a question. Go ahead, sir.
Actually, I have 2 questions.
Okay.
The first question is, this talks about spontaneously reborn in the last part of it. There's some beings that are spontaneously reborn. Can you please talk about that, what that means?
Yeah, so in the heavenly realm, there are beings that can be spontaneously reborn, meaning like for us, we have conception in the womb. There's an egg and sperm that comes together. There's a gestation period of about 9 months, and then we're kind of born into the world through the birthing canal, or nowadays we have surgeries, right? And there's this kind of gradual progression to this being born. Well, in the heavenly realm, there can be spontaneous birth. And there might even be that case in the animal realm as well. I'm not that familiar with that aspect of it, but I think in the animal realm, there can be those kinds of things as well, where there isn't this gradual development of a being and then it gradually comes into the world like a human being, which is what you're most familiar with. But instead, it's just instantaneous that this occurs. And this is occurring mainly in the formless realms, particularly in the heavenly realm.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was, and Buddha talks about learning the teachings by ear and reciting them verbally. And you said basically in that time we had to do it by chanting. Today we don't need to do it as much. But the question I guess that I have is, how much should you strive to memorize, and how much I'm not talking about percentage, but just general idea of what should be the kind of effort to memorize some of these important teachings.
Yeah, you need to commit the teachings to memory, but you don't need to memorize the Buddha's words word for word for word. So like the Eightfold Path, you need to be able to know that cold. Like when somebody would say maybe right intention, you need to know the intention of renunciation, non-ill will, and harmlessness. When we talk about right speech, you need to know, refrain from lying, slander, harsh speech, frivolous speech, and then the 5 factors of well-spoken speech, speaking at the proper time, what you say is true, gentle, beneficial, with a mind of loving kindness. You would like to go on and on like that throughout the entire Eightfold Path and be able to know every single aspect of each individual factor. that's what you would like to work on first, is getting a really deep understanding of the Eightfold Path and committing that to your memory. Not, like I said, not necessarily word for word, but understanding each aspect of those, the main points. And then from there, you are going to need to know things like the 7 factors of enlightenment, and you're going to need to know the 5 precepts and things like this. How much of that you commit to memory is going to be unique to each individual teaching. The core central teachings that I share, that are obviously the Buddha's, like the 3 universal truths, the 4 noble truths, the Eightfold Path, the 5 precepts, the 7 factors of enlightenment, the Brahma Viharas, the 10 fetters, and extensive meditation training. That's the stuff that you're going to really need to commit to your memory. Again, not word for word, but you're going to need to know the understanding of it and how to apply it, so that when you see certain symptoms, you can then apply the antidote. It's like building a tool belt. The more that you understand the teachings and you've got them committed to memory, as soon as you see anger arise in the mind, you know to cut it off and let it go. Bring in your loving kindness. That's going to quash the anger. Or you see your mind is muddled, you're going to know, apply right effort, cut that off, let it go, and arise this concentration. You see your mind shaken up with some pleasant feelings, cut it off with right effort, bring in some equanimity and tranquility and things like this. You're going to need to know these kinds of things. And the more that you study the teachings, you can commit this to memory. And it's like filling out your tool belt, so that whenever you see a particular problem in your own mind, you can then apply the antidote or solution in that particular situation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I have a couple questions coming in here on Zoom. Helena's asking, so it seems like people who study the teachings probably won't be rebirthed in the lower realms. It all depends how much someone has studied and how committed they are to transforming their mind. How much are they practicing? Just studying the teachings is great because that's the intellectual learning, but the real transformation to the mind is occurring during the practice of the teachings. So if somebody's practicing the teachings, this is where the real transformation is occurring. And now that's the causes and conditions that leads to rebirth. So during the lifetime of the Buddha, there were various people who were ordained with him that weren't actually practicing the teachings really well. They were intellectually starting to learn them and understand them, but they weren't practicing. In fact, I think it was his cousin or brother-in-law or somebody like this was like his arch nemesis, right? Like the Buddha loved all beings, but this individual was jealous of the Buddha because he had so many students and they all loved him so dearly that this individual was trying to kill the Buddha on different occasions so he could take over the community. This individual was wearing an orange robe and shaved his head, and he was logically a student of the Buddha, but he wasn't practicing the teachings. So it's not about how much you've learned necessarily, it's about what your practice looks like. So that's why it's so important to integrate the teachings into your life. And as you're training your mind, yes, you get to a point where it's very rare for an individual who's transformed their mind to a certain degree to be born into the lower realms. When you get to the first stage of enlightenment, you absolutely won't be reborn into the lower realms. Even if you're in like the jhanas or leading up to the jhanas, there's still the ability for you to come back into the human realm or be reborn in the heavenly realm. But, you know, in those other places where you haven't quite gotten to the jhanas, or you're not in the jhanas or the first stage of enlightenment, you can easily be reborn into the lower realms, even if you were learning the teachings. Chris is asking, I tend to think that memorizing the referenced teachings of Gotama Buddha's teachings in your book, word for word, will help me, and that possibly memorizing your books will help me too. I also find it enjoyable and that it helps me with memory and energy. Does this make sense to you? Or could it be something like conceit creeping in? No, memorizing the teachings, as the Buddha shared here, can be helpful, but that's not something that everybody has to do. What you need to commit to your memory is the understanding of the teachings and how to apply them in any specific situation. Because when you're in that conversation with your mother or your brother or your father, and you notice the frustration arising and you're getting ready to say something, you're not going to be able to say, hold on, Mom, let me look at the 5 factors of well-spoken speech before I talk. I need some time here. Can we just pause this conversation? And you're not going to be able to look at your book and figure that out, right? You're going to need to have those committed to memory and be asking the mind, is this the right time? Is this true? Is it gentle? Is it beneficial? Is it with a mind of loving kindness? You're going to be able to have that wisdom on board. So if you haven't committed that kind of thing to memory, you're not going to be able to get to the point where you tweak your practice and getting closer and closer to practicing the moral conduct. So if you would like to memorize the teachings, go for it. By all means, I would never stop anybody from doing that. But it's not just rote memorization that's going to help you. It's understanding how to apply these teachings in day-to-day life in any given situation. Julie, you have a question? Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, I was wondering that in Tibetan Buddhism, they talk about the bardos and all that stuff. Is that just something that's been imported from another Tibetan tradition? Because I don't ever think I've heard of anything like that being in the sutras. What
have you learned that the bardos are?
Well, it kind of sounds, if I were to compare it to the Christian tradition, the Catholic idea of kind of being in purgatory or some kind of transitional stage where you're not really here and you're not there.
Okay. I have seen a minor reference from the Buddha to something like that, but he didn't call it the bardos or anything like that. You'll see that when we get to the cycle of rebirth or the realms of existence book, volume 11, you'll see where he talks about this, but it's very minimal that he talks about it. It's that in-between period from death until rebirth that he doesn't really teach much about, or at least I haven't seen the teachings about that, because understanding that isn't really going to lead to the elimination of discontentedness in this life. So I suspect that's why he hasn't really taught much about it, or if it's out there and I just haven't seen it, I never really had to learn much about that in order to get to where I am today.
Yeah, there's a whole book that the Tibetan Book of the Dead. That's this whole book of teachings on that, and that's where I would just wonder at what point that kind of got in their tradition, because it doesn't seem to come from the Pali Canon.
Yeah, I can share that most of what I've seen in the Tibetan tradition is not what the Buddha actually taught, but any one particular thing of how it got there or when it got there, I wouldn't know those things.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right, so what I'm going to do is just wish all of you well. Thank you all for joining for today's class. It's been nice to share the teachings of the Buddha with all of you guys. Thank you for being dedicated to learn and grow and develop. It's really nice to come together with the same group of people, or at least a similar group of people each individual week, because now you guys can really learn together, almost like a cohort in college or university where you kind of work your way through. And of course, you're going to miss classes here and there, and that's what the recordings are for, but it's really nice to see you guys as a group to kind of go through and learning these teachings. So that's really wonderful to see. Next week, we're going to be starting volume 3, chapters 1 through 10. So if you'd like to download that or get that book, you're more than welcome to do that, and you'll be able to read it, because as I've mentioned to you, there's much more content in the books than what I could ever put into these classes. Tomorrow in the group learning program, I'm going to be in volume 1, chapter 18, which is all about God's creative actions. You have free will. So if you've learned about this being of God and you have a turbulent relationship with this being, I can help you to free that up a bit. Or if you're just not interested in having a relationship with this being at all and you'd still like to get to enlightenment, I can teach you how to do that as well. So if the ability for you to get to enlightenment isn't based on God, God's not the one making those decisions, it's you. So you can get to enlightenment without a relationship with God, but some people are interested in having a relationship with God, but they've been taught to fear God or pray to God, or that God's punishing you or rewarding you or controlling you or things like that. So I'm going to help you understand all of this as it relates to the path to enlightenment, because the Buddha did teach about God. This is one of the big misunderstandings in the world, is that people think the Buddha didn't teach about God, but he absolutely did. So I'm going to help you guys understand what he taught, and I'm going to help you to understand either how to have a relationship, a healthy relationship with this being, or to not have any relationship with this being and still get to enlightenment. So that's going to be tomorrow in the morning and then in the evening. In the middle of the day at 3 p.m. Thai time, I'm going to be starting our retreat, which is titled Purification of the Mind to Attain Enlightenment. This is where over the next essentially 5.5 days, I'm going to be spending a lot of time teaching about the 10 fetters and some other teachings that you would need to be able to get to enlightenment. This takes you from all the other foundational courses and programs like the Foundation of the Path to Enlightenment, the Harmony of Relationships, Experiencing the Jhanas and the 4 Stages of Enlightenment, the Group Learning Program, the Pali Canon and English Study Group, even the retreat in January that I teach, which is developing a life practice to attain the first stage of enlightenment, this retreat in August is taking you beyond all of that stuff and into where you can move from the first stage of enlightenment into enlightenment itself. Of course, you're not going to be enlightened by the end of the retreat, but you're going to be gaining the exposure to the things that you need to move from that first stage of enlightenment to enlightenment itself. So I'm going to be doing that this week. And of course, it's going to be recorded on YouTube and Facebook. So if you can't attend live, you'll be able to digest it that way if you'd like. And thank you all for joining for the class. Thank you for reading. Thank you for your questions. Perhaps I'll see you guys in a future class. Have a very lovely and wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Sawadee ka. Thank you again for watching. Enjoy your meditation. Look forward to seeing you online and answering any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.